Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the law in Exodus chapters 19 and 20. Earlier in Exodus chapter 14, we saw the rebellion of Israel after they had crossed through the Red Sea. They complain, and there's a number of issues, so we call that Israel rebels. Now we come to the covenant and the law and the commandments that are going to be given. We're going to start in chapter 19. We'll see the establishment of the covenant. We'll see the law, and then we'll see the stipulations under that law. That'll take us all the way to chapter 24. Next, in chapters 25 through 31, we're going to see the instructions for the tabernacle. And then after that, again, we're going to have a rebellion activity at the hands of Israel, where, again, Israel is going to complain. They're going to worship the golden calf, and we'll see how that plays out. Exodus 19:1. In the third month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, that's where they had been attacked by Amalek and the Amalekites, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. If you go to the traditional location of Mount Sinai, and I'm inclined to think that's the correct location, there's a wide open space out in front of that mountain. That's what you're looking at here with my back to the mountain, looking at this picture here. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself." Notice God starts with relaying what he has done on behalf of Israel. Next, we're going to move. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice. You see, he started off talking about what he had done. Now he's going to speak about what Israel is to do on the basis of what he's done. If you will indeed obey my voice and keep my commandment, my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's what God's going to do if Israel does what they're going to do. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Notice God says, if you obey my voice, keep my covenant, you're going to be my special people, because the whole earth is mine. So I've chosen you to be my special people, and you will be to me a kingdom of priests. Now, what is a priest? A priest is someone who represents the people to God. A prophet does just the opposite. A prophet comes from God, and he represents God to the people. But a priest represents the people to God, and Israel is supposed to play the part of a priest for the entire world. A priest, a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and said before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do." We'll see how long that lasts. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So it came about on the third day. I find that interesting, that there's some time passes. And on the third day when it was morning, reminds me of another third day when it was morning, where the stone is rolled away and when Jesus rose from the dead. But here on this third day, when it was morning, that there was thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud trumpet sound, so all the people were in the camp, they trembled. In other words, God shows up. God shows up on the third day. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently when the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. And God speaks, and now he's going to give his 10 words, his 10 commandments. Now notice they are singular. As we say in the old King James, thou instead of ye. Whenever you see ye in the old King James, that's actually plural. Thou is singular. It's you, singular. are to do this, or you singular are not to do that. And each one of the laws is singular. It speaks to the individual, and it speaks to the individual in a day and an age when everything was about the community. So this is highly irregular. They're singular. Secondly, they can be divided into two groups. First of all, those that are directed toward God, that's the first four, and the others are directed toward men. So we have those that are directed toward God. For example, no other gods, and then there's to be no idols, and God's name is to be holy, and you are to keep his day holy, the Sabbath. Those are the first four commandments. The others are directed toward men: respect for parents, and no murder, and no adultery, and no stealing, and no false witness. And it's about that short. We read in ours, thou shalt not do. It's in the Hebrews, no murder, no adultery, no stealing, no false witness, no coveting. And those are directed toward people. Now, those first commandments, the commandments toward God, there's reasons given for each command. You don't need reasons for those that are given toward men. The ones that are given toward God, those first four commandments are completely unique to this Constitution. There's no other society in the ancient world that had laws like that. You mean only one God? Every other country had all sorts of gods. You mean don't take the Lord's name in vain? No, we always use the name of our God. You mean no idols? Well, what do you mean no idols? A day off, a Sabbath day? And yet those other commandments, beginning with commandment number 5 and all the way, almost to the end, there's no reason needed because these laws were common to most of the ancient cultures of that day. All ancient cultures had laws against murder, and against stealing, and against adultery, and against false witness, until you get to the very last. And that's a unique one too, the law of coveting. Because how do you have a law against something that is in the heart? Well, we saw that they were singular, they can be divided into two groups, but also the stipulations that follow serve as further interpretations of the Ten Commandments. We're going to come back and look at that next time, but I want to look at the Ten Commandments first. The first commandment, then the Lord spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. Every other culture had all sorts of gods. This was the first culture in history. You say, wait a minute, what about Egypt with Atken? That happens later. That happens after this, as I understand the chronology. You shall have no other gods before me. Second commandment, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. Why can't you make an image of God? Because he's invisible. You can't see him. He is the invisible God, so any image that you try to make of him will be woefully inadequate and incorrect. And that would not be appropriate. He goes on to say, you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Notice the inequity of the judgment versus the grace. Of the judgment, there's the third and the fourth generations. Of the grace and loyalty and loving kindness, it goes to thousands. The third commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain, because the name of God is significant. It is not to be used emptily. It is to be used carefully. In fact, by the New Testament times, the name of God will be used so carefully that the Jews will actually refrain from using it at all. And so when we have the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, instead of writing the name, what we would probably pronounce as Yahweh, they will substitute that with the Greek word for Lord. And notice, normally our English translations do the same thing. Whenever you see that word Lord in all capital letters, or sometimes it's the word God in all capital letters, it can be either one. But whenever you see in your translation all that big capital letters, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that's telling you that that's the name of God. And the translators are being equally careful not to take the name of the Lord in vain. The fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or your female servant or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. The Sabbath rest was to be extended to all, free or slave, man or animal, that they might rest, yes, but that they might remember the Lord, who himself set the pattern by creating in 6 days and then resting on the seventh. For in 6 days the Lord made heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. To this day, nearly every Christian that I know of takes 1 day in 7 and sets it aside for rest, for remembrance, and for worship. Now, you say, well, why do we do that in so many churches on the first day of the week? I think probably the reason, historically, is because Christ rose on the first day of the week, and that became a special rest, a new creation rest into which we have entered. The fifth commandment, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Actually, Paul quotes this promise in Ephesians chapter 6 and calls it the first commandment with promise. So the command is to honor your father and your mother. Now notice it doesn't say just little children do this. It says it's just you honor your father and mother. So I think that applies to not just little children, but to adult children, to all sorts of children, to honor them, to respect them. It means, I think, even to care for them when that's required. That your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. The sixth command. Now we're getting very short commands. You shall not murder. No murder. And Jesus takes this command and says, if you're going to keep that on the inside, not just on the outside, you shouldn't even hate your brother. You shouldn't harbor hatred. You shouldn't harbor mental murder, not just physical murder. The seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery, because marriage is sacred. God instituted marriage, and so he places into his commandments a command showing the sacredness, the sanctity of marriage. The eighth commandment, you shall not steal, because property is something that God has also ordained. The ninth commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now I think we can expand on that. I think we can say we ought to be truth tellers. In fact, Ephesians chapter 4 talks about, and we translate that speaking the truth in love. Actually, I like the Greek better, where it says truthing in love. And we are to be truth tellers in those things that we say. But especially notice bearing false witness against your neighbor. We shouldn't be speaking falsehoods about others. And finally, we come to the 10th commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And with the 10th commandment, we go past the outer keeping of the physical keeping of commandments. We go right to the heart of the matter. You see, if I'm going to keep the 10th commandment, that's telling me that if I've committed mental murder, or mental adultery, or mental stealing, or mental false witness, if I've done it on the inside, then I'm already guilty of not just breaking one commandment, but two. Well, all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. God's law does that. It separates us from him. Then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but let not God speak to us, or we will die." They're asking Moses, "Moses, will you be a mediator, an intermediary between God and us, that we not die?" And so Moses does become a mediator. And in that, we have a better mediator today. We have the mediator, Jesus Christ, who is the mediator, the go-between between God and us, the one who made the way open where we can come to God. Now we come to the question, is the law in effect today? To answer that, I think we have to point to the continuing character of the law. First of all, since the law is of an unchanging character, that is, it reflects the righteousness of Christ, then God's law, which is a written revelation of his character, is also holy and unchanging. That is, if it was wrong to commit murder at one time, it's wrong to commit murder at another time. If it was wrong to commit adultery, then it's wrong to commit adultery. If it was wrong to try to worship more than one God, or to take God's name in vain, or to not give him honor, then it's wrong in every age, because that standard of righteousness is holy and unchanging. Secondly, God is able to set the boundaries of his law. You see, that's why you look at churches today, and we commented that there are many churches today that worship on Sunday instead of on Saturday. And I think Jesus set that path for us when he called himself the Lord of the Sabbath. He is free to interpret and to say how his law is to be used, and we can listen to his voice in that. Thirdly, Jesus specifically stated that the law would not be done away with. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 19, he says, there won't be one jot or one tittle until all be fulfilled. Now, in the New Testament, the foundational laws are always applicable. We see that, for example, in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, where Paul says, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law." And he goes on to say, "For this you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet." Those are all parts of the law. And if there's any other commandment, it's summed up in this saying, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." You see, we're to do that. Why are we to do that? Because that fulfills the law. That's the summation of the law. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Secondly, God is able to set the boundaries of his law. We already noted that with Jesus calling himself the Lord of the Sabbath. The underlying principles of the case laws, and we're going to get into the case laws next time, the underlying principles of the case laws are always applicable. They merely illustrate the foundational law, so that, for example, Paul can quote 1 Corinthians chapter 9, which talks about how you shall not you shall not muzzle the ox that threshes the grain. And he can take that principle and say, based on that principle, you ought to be paying your pastors. And that applies. Even though the law never said anything about pastors, the application of the law still applies for today. The ceremonial laws, though, found their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And because of that, we do not follow the ceremonial laws today. Most churches into which you go, you won't see an animal sacrifice in the morning or the evening. You won't see incense upon the altar, because those things were fulfilled in Christ. They pointed to Jesus and were fulfilled in him.